Hey there, welcome in. Thanks for tuning in to Parentless Podcast. My guest is Liz Gleason. Liz will talk about her podcast and her grief education program. Take it away, Liz.
The roughest time of my life was easily post-separation. But separation and divorce are a disenfranchised grief. We don't acknowledge them. Certainly here in Ireland, I know people have a little bit more clue. In the States, about 55 of marriages in the States end up in divorce. And the last time I looked at the stats in Ireland, it's 7%. So people just don't get divorced or,
Wow.
It's really not common here. It's only starting to be a thing that people allow themselves to consider. But the result is that when you separate, the general idea is, oh, well, they've chosen that, so that's okay. Nobody brings around food or invites you for Christmas or drops in a card. And easily that was the roughest time in my life. And back to Shapes of Grief, my podcast, this is what I really wanted to do, was highlight that not every death brings people to their knees. And some non-deaths like separation or hysterectomy or, like you said, other types of loss can absolutely bring people to their knees. So when people wrote, mostly on social media, if I shared that my father had died, and when people were like, that's devastating, that's awful, I feel so bad, I was like, no, that doesn't actually feel right. I genuinely felt like I felt gratitude that he didn't have COVID. So that meant we were able to keep him at home, that I was able to be with him 24/7 in the context of when he died. He died during a global pandemic, during one of the lockdowns. I would be supporting people whose loved ones died in hospital. They weren't able to be with them. They had to say, their I love yous over an iPod, So everything has, like, a lot of perspectives have shifted due to the pandemic. So my overriding feeling was he was not agitated. He was not in pain. It isn't a tragedy that at 92 you die. It's a loss, but it's not a tragedy. So, possibly, Steph, because I'd been preparing for so long, it was like, okay, we did his death really well for him. And so I felt immense gratitude for that. And when people commented with, it's just awful, it's devastating, it didn't fit. Devastating is when someone dies too soon or suddenly, or you're not expecting it, or out of the order of things, or they died when they shouldn't have died, That's devastating. But this was, for me, it wasn't devastating.
Liz, I'm really interested in learning more about grief and everything related to it. Where do you think I should start?
The Shapes of Grief education would be a really good place to start, genuinely, because we look at, where did the theories come from? Where did we ever think it was okay to say grieve, then move on? Where did the stages of grief come from? Why do we know that they're just not a thing now? But how can we be thankful that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did shine a light on grief, To understand grief, for me anyway, the theories and models and where they've come from and how our understanding of grief has changed throughout the ages is really interesting, and it's really vital. And I think one thing that's so important when we are supporting people who are grieving is to be able to offer psychoeducation. Here's what's happening in your nervous system. Here's why you're responding in this way. This is why you can't sleep at night. Well, I explained the biology of it. And then they go, oh my God, it's just my nervous system. It's not that I'm going crazy. We need to understand why meaning making is important, or why we continue a bond now. We don't move on or forget them. We need to understand why relocating our loved ones is something we do in therapy, so that we can keep having a relationship with them while they're dead, because that's what most people want to do. Anyway, it is fascinating, and certainly the clinical application of grief education, working with someone who's grieving, it's a whole different set of rules and a whole different set of tools to regular psychotherapy. and kindness and humanity are absolutely vital. So the grief education program that I've developed, I really hope goes a long way in addressing it. And, I've kept it really cheap so that people can afford it. And there's 40 hours in there of really interesting discussions, different perspectives of grief, types of loss, types of grief from the experts themselves.
Okay, I'll check it out. So anyone that's interested in your program is able to join.
Anyone can sign up. Yeah. If you're grieving and you want to understand more about your grief experience, it's very accessible. But it's really, I set it up because I don't know what it's like in the States, Steph, but a lot of people in Ireland and in Europe are not properly grief informed or grief educated. And what can happen is someone has a bereavement experience and they happen to also be a social worker or a psychologist. Suddenly they think they're a grief expert or a grief educator, and they're just not. And harm can be done. So I suppose I said all of this in the context of I was just really interested in the subject. Yes, I had my own losses, but not in the way that people might expect. And if we are going to be a grief educator, we need to offer the whole spectrum of experiences and not just ones that resonate with our own experience. You know what I'll do actually, Steph? I will make a discount code, Parentless 10. So if anyone listening now would like to sign up for the grief education program, use the code Parentless10 for a 10% discount, and I'll keep it valid till the end of 2021.
Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about the podcast or the education program before we go?
I set up the podcast to help people who are bereaved to feel less alone. I thought that by sharing stories, that both the storyteller would benefit and the person listening would benefit, to normalize the grief experience, to help people identify and go, oh my gosh, me too, But it kind of developed a life of its own, like having done a 2-year master's in bereavement studies, I was a natural educator and I wasn't consciously doing this, but as people were sharing their stories, I would say, oh yeah, we call that continuing bonds, or in grief theory, we call that meaning making or relocation. And, so I was bringing in a lot of what I had learned into the conversations with people. And then something started to happen. I started getting messages from doctors, end-of-life doulas, psychotherapists saying, I love your podcast. It's so educational. There's so much really good information. And so that is where the Shapes of Grief education program came from. It was like, okay, well, if this is actually educating people unintentionally, how amazing would it be if I intentionally tried to educate people, intentionally tried to help people become more grief informed and grief aware.
Can you tell us how we can contact you?
Yeah, www.shapesofgrief.com. And there you can find all the podcast episodes. There's about 74, I think, now. And they're also on every sort of platform. Please give me a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. Also on the website then is the Grief Education Program, which is about $230. It's €199. It's really exceptional value. There's a lot of really, really good content there. And like I said, anybody with an interest in learning more about grief will be served, but particularly mental health professionals who are working with grief. It's like a really good module for an MA program. And then there's also some free resources there. I link to just some interesting videos on certain perspectives of grief that may not be covered in the course, but that are really important. And the course, it's still a work in progress. I mean, there's 40 hours there. There's more topics of loss that need to be included. There's already a lot there, but I do hope to grow it. So if you are someone who looks at it and says, I'm not represented, or my loss is not represented, I really want to hear from you, because I want this to really reflect on the depth and breadth of the grief experience, and that everybody who engages with the program will feel that they're seen and that they've been heard.
Hi, it's Steph again. I want to just thank you so much for being here for this Grief Podcast Spotlight. And now on to another matter of business. I want to thank my latest patron over at patreon.com/parentlesspodcast. Lindsay H., welcome to the team. Thank you so much for being a supporter of Parentless Podcast. If you are like Lindsay, you may also be a supporter. If you want, you can sign up on Patreon. You can also rate, review, and share the show by spreading the word about the show. You can talk to a friend. You can share it on Facebook. You can talk to your coworker and anybody else that you think of. There are so many people that might be wanting to hear other people's stories that we just don't know about. All right. Thank you so much. Lindsay, once again, you rock.